I was speaking when Grant Holloway smiled, raised one finger, and stopped me cold in front of the board. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't want context. He wanted silence. Just a secretary, he said, casually, like labeling furniture. And the room accepted it without protest or hesitation today. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I was there because details break companies when ignored. As executive assistant to the CEO, I tracked contracts, schedules, and risks. Grant collected applause and titles. I collected errors before they became disasters. Quietly, repeatedly. During meetings, emails, weekends, audits, reviews, alone, unseen, unpaid. The meeting moved on without me. Charts advanced. Voices overlapped. Grant spoke about speed, confidence, momentum. I had flagged a clause that morning. He never looked at it. In his world, authority replaced reading, and confidence replaced verification. Especially from someone like me, who asked inconvenient questions professionally, calmly always. I felt heat rise, not fear. Shock landed first, then irritation, then humiliation, stacked neatly. No termination followed, no paperwork, just subtraction. My voice removed, my role minimized, my value erased by a sentence delivered for effect, not accuracy. While others avoided my eyes and pretended this was leadership somehow, Grant thrived on hierarchy. Titles were shields. He trusted volume over substance. I trusted margins, footnotes, and consequences. That difference sat between us like a fault line. Everyone could feel it. No one addressed it, not yet. Anyway, because discomfort is easier than accountability when power feels secure and loud. When the meeting adjourned, people filed past me like I'd become invisible mid-sentence. Grant didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd already won the room. I stayed seated, steady, listening to the hum of decisions made too quickly to survive scrutiny or patience, discipline, foresight, caution, balance, later consequences. Before leaving, I gathered my notes. One document sat where it shouldn't have. Untouched, overlooked. I didn't announce it. I didn't highlight it. I simply slid it into my folder and stood up. Silence can be a strategy, especially when everyone underestimates you after calling you just a secretary publicly. That moment probably landed heavier than expected. If it stirred something in you, pause for a second and take a slow, deep breath. Sometimes grounding yourself is the only way to keep perspective. Where are you listening from right now? Stay with me and subscribe if this kind of story resonates. Because what happens next is when silence starts to push back. I didn't leave the building angry that day. Anger would have been too simple. What stayed with me was the weight of being erased after years of quietly holding things together. That weight had been building long before Grant decided my voice was optional. It had been accumulating in emails never answered, meetings where my notes were used but my presence ignored, and decisions credited to the loudest person in the room. I had spent nearly a decade operating behind Grant's confidence. When contracts arrived late, I stayed. When deadlines collapsed, I rebuilt them. I learned how our vendors operated, how our regulators thought, and where our legal exposure hid. I wasn't trained for applause. I was trained for prevention, and prevention rarely leaves fingerprints. Grant thrived on optics. He loved momentum and bold language. When deals closed cleanly, he praised his instincts. When something nearly failed, he praised his leadership for catching it early. No one asked who caught it. No one asked why the same issues kept disappearing before they reached his desk. I learned early that correcting him publicly wasn't rewarded. Quiet fixes were safer, for him and for the company. There were moments that should have mattered. A licensing delay that would have triggered penalties. A compliance filing that didn't match updated guidelines. A vendor clause buried so deep it would have surfaced only during litigation. Each time, I intervened quietly. Each time, Grant walked away looking decisive. Each time, my name stayed out of it. What made it worse wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the assumption that my work was automatic, incidental, replaceable. Grant began referring to me as support, even when I was the one explaining consequences to his legal team. In meetings, he summarized points I had drafted hours earlier, reshaping them as spontaneous insights. People nodded. I stayed silent. The imbalance sharpened over time. New executives joined and never learned what I did. They learned what Grant said I did. That difference mattered. It meant I was invisible when things went right and exposed when something needed blame. The structure rewarded confidence, not accuracy, and Grant knew how to use that imbalance to his advantage. Still, I stayed, not out of loyalty to him, but to the system I understood better than anyone else. I knew how the contracts linked together. I knew how one signature affected another department 3 steps away. I understood the legal chain not as documents, but as consequences. No one else had ever taken the time to map it fully. That knowledge became isolating. It sat with me during long evenings and early mornings. It followed me into meetings where I listened more than I spoke. It made me cautious, because I knew how fragile the structure really was beneath Grant's confidence. By the time he dismissed my warning in that room, it wasn't the first time he had dismissed me. It was just the first time he did it out loud. And as I walked back to my desk afterward, one thought stayed steady beneath the resentment. I wasn't just a witness to how this company worked. I was the only person who truly understood how everything connected. That realization would matter later, when silence stopped protecting them and started protecting me instead, quietly. I found the mistake late, not because it was hidden, but because no one else slowed down enough to see it. The merger documents were already circulating, stamped urgent, pushed through inboxes like a race everyone pretended was strategic. I stayed after hours reviewing the language, not out of suspicion, but out of habit built from years of cleaning up avoidable messes. The clause appeared harmless at first glance, wrapped in technical phrasing and references to legacy agreements. But when I followed the cross-references, a pattern formed, if triggered. The provision allowed a third party to assume critical operating rights before final closure. It was rare, outdated, and still legally intact. Worse, it did not require employee status to activate. It required timing and accuracy. My stomach tightened as I traced the implications. The entire merger depended on uninterrupted control of a single platform. Lose that, and the acquisition collapsed under its own weight. Penalties followed. Litigation followed. Reputation damage followed. I checked the numbers again, then checked the language again. The risk wasn't theoretical, it was executable. I requested a meeting with Grant that same morning. I kept my explanation concise, grounded, unemotional. I pointed to the section, the references, the exposure. He listened for less than a minute before leaning back. He said we didn't have time for hypotheticals. He said legal had reviewed it. He said speed mattered more than caution. And then he reminded me, gently but clearly, that I wasn't positioned to question strategy. The dismissal landed heavier than I expected, not because he disagreed, but because he never actually looked. The decision had already been made. Momentum had become a substitute for diligence. I watched him move on to timelines and press messaging while the risk sat untouched between us. After that, the building felt quieter, not calm, just indifferent. I sent a follow-up email outlining the issue, attaching supporting documentation. It was acknowledged by an assistant and buried under scheduling requests. No escalation followed. No questions came back. The silence was procedural, not accidental. I spent the rest of the day replaying the logic, searching for an error that would make me wrong. I wanted to be wrong. Being wrong would mean safety. But the more I tested it, the more solid it became. The clause survived every scenario. Employment status didn't matter. Access to public filings did. Timing did. That realization isolated me completely. I understood something that no one wanted to understand, because understanding it would slow everything down. Grant had chosen acceleration. The company followed. I was left standing with a problem that didn't care about hierarchy or confidence. As evening settled, one final detail locked into place. The clause activated upon submission. Not approval. That meant once the process began. Control shifted instantly. I sat back, exhausted, aware that the warning phase was over. What remained was inevitability. And the most dangerous part was this: the mistake would not disappear when I did. I knew then that isolation was the cost of precision. Everyone else measured success in speed and confidence. But I measured it in avoided damage. The company believed silence meant compliance. They mistook restraint for weakness. I carried the knowledge forward quietly, understanding that warnings only matter when someone is willing to hear them. I wasn't asking for authority. I was asking for attention. And as the merger accelerated beyond caution, I accepted something colder than fear. If the structure failed, it would fail by its own design, not by my interference. And that truth followed me out of the office without asking permission. It was the kind of certainty that doesn't shout, doesn't warn, and doesn't beg to be believed. Because eventually consequences introduce themselves without emotion, explanation, or mercy. I walked away, knowing the risk was active, patient, and perfectly aligned with the rules they trusted blindly. That was the loneliest part. The email arrived without ceremony. No subject line designed to soften the impact. No request to talk. Just a block of text waiting when I opened my inbox. Written in the careful language companies use when they want distance more than clarity. It informed me that my position was terminated. Effective immediately. Further instructions would follow. They always say that. Even when there are no instructions worth following, there was no meeting, no confrontation. Grant didn't appear. He didn't need to. This wasn't personal anymore. It was administrative, clean, efficient, final. The kind of decision made when leadership wants something removed without friction or witnesses. An hour later, Nora Simmons from HR appeared at my desk with a printed copy of the same email. She didn't sit. She didn't apologize. She read it aloud like a weather report, eyes fixed just past my shoulder. When she finished, she asked for my badge and company laptop. Her voice was steady, practiced. I handed them over without hesitation. Resistance would have changed nothing. As she walked away, my screen refreshed on its own. The access prompt flashed once, then disappeared. My credentials were gone, shared drives, calendars, internal systems, years of work sealed off by a process that took less than a minute. That was the moment I understood how thoroughly a company can erase someone without raising its voice. I packed slowly, not because I needed time, but because I felt nothing urging me to hurry. The office continued around me, keyboards clicking, conversations half-whispered. No one asked what happened. No one wanted to know. Silence wasn't cruelty. It was compliance. People protect their own continuity first. Walking out felt strangely ordinary. No escort, no scene. Just the quiet awareness that my name no longer belonged to that structure. The identity I had carried for nearly a decade dissolved into something smaller and heavier. Not anger, not relief, just absence. Outside. The weight settled. I wasn't processing betrayal or shock. I was processing acceptance. The decision had been made days ago. The email was just confirmation. Grant had chosen speed, and speed requires removing friction. I had become friction, at home. I placed the box on the table and sat beside it, staring at nothing in particular. That was when a detail surfaced, uninvited but clear. The termination timestamp. The language in the notice. The phrasing wasn't careless. It was standardized. And in that standardization, something shifted by severing my employment immediately. The company had altered my legal position. I wasn't bound by internal escalation policies anymore. I wasn't constrained by reporting chains. I wasn't required to defer concerns upward and wait. The safeguards designed to control employee behavior no longer applied. It was a small thing, easily overlooked. But systems are built on small things. That change activated a clause I had been reviewing days earlier. Not intentionally, not strategically, simply as a consequence of how the company chose to remove me. The realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. There's a difference. Satisfaction is emotional. Clarity is structural. And clarity has weight. Here's the lesson I didn't understand until that moment when an organization cuts you loose without thought. It often cuts its own protections at the same time. Efficiency creates blind spots. Speed skips consequences. And decisions made to silence someone can sometimes give them exactly what they need to be heard later. I didn't celebrate the realization. I acknowledged it, calmly. This wasn't about revenge. It was about sequence. Actions trigger conditions. Conditions trigger outcomes. No one had planned this. That was the point, by the end of the evening. My role was gone. But my understanding wasn't. The system that erased me had shifted its own boundaries in the process, and while Grant believed the problem had been removed, the structure itself had quietly changed shape. I closed my laptop and sat back. Not plotting, not reacting, just accepting the new reality. I was no longer an employee. I was something else now. And whatever came next would no longer happen inside their walls, but entirely within the rules they trusted enough to overlook. I didn't read the contracts as an employee anymore. That distinction mattered. I read them as a private individual with time, distance, and no obligation to protect anyone's pride. The documents felt different without the pressure to summarize them for someone else. There was no urgency now, only structure, language, and consequences waiting to be understood. I spread the papers across my dining table, aligning sections the way I always had, schedules on one side, definitions on the other. The merger agreement sat at the center, thick and familiar. I wasn't looking for emotion or validation. I was looking for authority, the kind that exists quietly inside legal language. What stood out wasn't a dramatic loophole. It was consistency. The clause I had flagged before didn't depend on titles, employment, or internal approval. It referenced parties, actions, and timing. Nothing more, nothing less. Authority came from compliance with procedure, not from where someone sat in the organizational chart. I traced the logic carefully. If a claim was submitted properly, control shifted automatically. No discretion, no committee vote, no executive override. The mechanism was designed to function without personalities involved. That was its strength. And also its risk. It assumed diligence from those in charge. It assumed someone was paying attention. I checked again for restrictions tied to internal roles. There were none. The language was old, inherited from previous transactions, carried forward without revision. It had survived audits, restructures, and leadership changes because it had never been challenged. Everyone trusted the system without reading it closely. That realization didn't trigger excitement. It triggered focus. I wasn't angry enough to rush, and I wasn't afraid enough to hesitate. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about precision. I listed requirements on a legal pad, not to plan a confrontation, but to confirm feasibility. The action required was almost absurdly small. A submission, a nominal fee, documentation already in my possession. The process existed for rare contingencies, not personal disputes, yet it didn't care why it was used. It only cared whether it was used correctly. I paused there, not to second-guess myself, but to respect the gravity of the step. Control doesn't announce itself loudly. It appears quietly. When rules are followed and others are distracted, I reviewed everything one more time, then set the papers aside. What struck me most was how little emotion the process required. There was no need for arguments, exposure, or persuasion. The system didn't ask how I felt or what had happened to me. It only asked whether conditions were met. For years, I had been told my role was administrative, supportive, replaceable, yet the authority sitting on my table had nothing to do with my former title. It existed independently, waiting for someone patient enough to read through what others dismissed. I understood then that being underestimated had given me something rare, Freedom. Freedom to act without expectations, without scrutiny, without interference. Grant had removed me from the room. Believing that ended my influence. In reality, it removed his. I didn't rush to act. Control requires timing, not impulse. I gathered the documents neatly and placed them back into their folder. The next step would be simple, but its impact would not. And for the first time since my name disappeared from the system, I wasn't reacting to events. I was guiding them, quietly. Within rules everyone else trusted enough to ignore. That control felt unfamiliar, but steady. I wasn't stepping outside the structure. I was moving deeper into it. Every organization believes its safeguards are neutral, that rules exist to prevent chaos. Few consider what happens when those same rules empower the wrong person, or the unexpected one. I considered that carefully. Not with satisfaction, but with respect for the mechanics involved. Power, I realized, doesn't always announce itself through authority or permission. Sometimes it waits in margins, activated by attention. And attention, unlike titles, cannot be taken away once learned. This was the beginning, though nothing outward had changed yet. If you're listening closely, you already know what's coming next. Don't you? I chose a morning when nothing looked urgent. That mattered. Systems notice anomalies faster when people are calm. I worked from my kitchen table, documents arranged precisely, phone turned face down. This wasn't a moment for witnesses, commentary, or second opinions. It was a moment for execution. The action itself was simple. That was the part no one would ever believe. I completed a form that already existed, attached documentation I already possessed, and submitted it through a channel designed to accept it without question. No speeches, no explanations, no names highlighted, just accuracy, just compliance. I checked every field twice. Dates aligned, references matched. The language mirrored the contract exactly. Not paraphrased, not softened. I paid the nominal fee required to trigger processing. It felt almost insulting how small the amount was, compared to the weight it carried. The system accepted it without hesitation. There was no confirmation email congratulating me, no alert signaling impact, only a neutral receipt number and a timestamp. That was enough. Procedures don't celebrate, they record. As soon as the submission went through, the clock started running. Not visibly, not dramatically, but legally. Deadlines shifted, conditions activated, dependencies changed. The mechanism had been designed to move quietly, assuming good faith and limited use. It didn't know why it was being used now. It didn't need to. I didn't contact anyone afterward. That restraint took more effort than the action itself. Years of being ignored had trained me to explain, justify, and clarify. This time, silence was essential. Any communication would have slowed things down, invited interference, or alerted the wrong people too early. The tension settled in my shoulders, sharp but controlled. I wasn't anxious about whether it would work. I was aware of what would happen when it did. Systems don't fail loudly, they fail incrementally. Then suddenly, the reaction wouldn't start with Grant. It would start with reports not aligning, access requests flagged, and approvals stalled without explanation. By mid-afternoon, the first signal appeared, subtle enough that only someone watching would notice. A public filing updated its status automatically. No human had touched it yet. The system had simply acknowledged a change in condition and adjusted its records accordingly. That was the twist no one ever anticipates. People believe authority comes before recognition. In reality, recognition comes first. Authority catches up later. I refreshed the page once, then closed my laptop. Watching it too closely wouldn't accelerate anything. The process was moving at the speed it was designed to move, indifferent to impatience. My role now was to stay out of its way. I went about my day as if nothing had happened. Errands, calls returned, dinner prepared. The world remained stubbornly normal. That normalcy amplified the tension. Somewhere else. Within databases and compliance systems, my action was being logged, indexed, and cross-checked without emotion. That night, I reviewed the submission one last time in my mind, not out of doubt, but discipline. Every requirement had been met. Every rule followed. There was no angle for dismissal, no shortcut to reversal. The design assumed honesty and diligence. I had provided both. What struck me most was how alone the moment was. No applause, no validation, just the awareness that something irreversible had been set in motion. Control doesn't feel powerful when it's real. It feels quiet, heavy, and precise. By the time I went to sleep, the system had already done more than any person could have. It had noticed, it had recorded, and it had begun adjusting outcomes long before anyone with a title would understand why. That was the advantage of acting without announcing yourself. The reaction always starts where no one is looking. I didn't hear about the fallout right away. That was expected. Systems rarely announce themselves when they begin correcting a problem. They signal quietly, through delays, discrepancies, and questions no one wants to ask out loud. I waited, calm enough to notice patterns instead of headlines. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from an old colleague in legal. It wasn't detailed. It didn't need to be. She wrote that outside counsel had been pulled into an emergency review and that everyone looked tense. Lawyers only panic when something threatens structure, not reputation. That told me enough. The merger timeline stalled without explanation. Press drafts paused. Approvals that had sailed through suddenly required secondary sign-offs. No one admitted anything was wrong. But the movement stopped. Deals don't freeze for emotional reasons. They freeze because a dependency has shifted somewhere deep inside the framework. Grant reacted the way he always did when momentum slowed. He pushed harder. He demanded updates, called meetings, asked for assurances he didn't intend to read. Speed had always worked for him before. This time, speed only amplified the silence pushing back. I watched from a distance. Not through gossip, but through public signals. Filings adjusted language. Risk disclosures expanded subtly. A compliance bulletin referenced a procedural trigger without naming it. The system was responding exactly as designed, cautiously and without blame. Inside the company, confusion spread. Legal teams hate uncertainty. It means something is operating outside expectation. I imagined the conference rooms. The binders reopened. The searches for a cause that didn't involve admitting someone had been warned. Lawyers don't look for villains first. They look for documents. Grant still believed this was a temporary slowdown. He treated it like a supply delay or a negotiation tactic. He didn't consider that control itself might have shifted. Leaders rarely do. They assume authority is permanent, even when it's conditional. What I found almost fascinating was how little noise it made at first. No alerts, no emails announcing a problem. Just friction, requests unanswered, decisions deferred. The system doesn't accuse, it constrains. By the end of the week, the tone changed. Advisors stopped offering reassurance and started asking for time. That's when panic enters the room, not with shouting, but with pauses. When lawyers ask for time, they are measuring damage. Grant lost his temper publicly for the first time, not at me, at everyone else. He demanded to know who had slowed the deal and why no one had caught it sooner. No one answered directly, because no one knew who to blame. The source wasn't a person anymore, and that was the most important shift. The reaction had moved beyond individuals. It lived inside processes now. Even if Grant suspected sabotage, there was nothing to confront. No rogue employee, no violated policy, just a condition that existed. I stayed quiet. Waiting isn't passive when you understand the mechanics involved. Every hour that passed narrowed options. Reversals require authority and time. Authority was being questioned. Time was already gone. The twist arrived without ceremony. Grant didn't know who had triggered the change. He couldn't. The system recorded compliance. Not intent, To it. The action was legitimate, ordinary, and complete. That ignorance mattered more than his anger. As I watched events unfold, I understood something clearly. The company wasn't unraveling because of conflict. It was unraveling because it had trusted speed over structure for too long. The system wasn't punishing anyone. It was correcting an imbalance. I waited, calm and unseen. As the consequences continued to surface, the reaction had begun, and it didn't require my presence anymore. I let the quiet do its work, trusting process over impulse, knowing visibility would come later. After structure finished speaking, patience wasn't weakness here. It was alignment with rules already in motion. Rules that would soon force conversations no one could interrupt or dismiss again. Eventually, accountability arrives without drama, guided by systems that remember everything, especially what leaders choose to ignore when warned in silence now. There was something in the back that no one expected. Grant called me sooner than I expected, but later than he should have. That timing told me everything. He didn't reach out when the system first resisted him. He reached out when resistance turned into immobility. The call came through an unrecognized number. I answered anyway. Silence stretched on the line for a second too long, the way it does when someone is deciding which version of themselves to use. Then his voice appeared, smooth, controlled, carrying the same authority he'd relied on for years. "Maribel," he said, as if we were picking up a conversation that hadn't ended badly. He started where men like Grant always start, above the problem. He spoke about misunderstandings, about timing issues, about how things had become unnecessarily complicated. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the dismissal. Instead, he framed the situation as an inconvenience that required cooperation from both sides. I let him talk. Power reveals itself when it doesn't feel challenged. When that didn't work, his tone shifted. The warmth drained out of his voice, replaced by warning. He reminded me of confidentiality clauses, of reputational risk, of how quickly narratives can turn against people without platforms. He implied consequences without naming them, assuming fear would do the work for him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I simply listened, because nothing weakens a threat faster than letting it finish without reaction. Then came the pivot. Grant offered to make things right. Consulting fees, a settlement, a role more appropriate to my experience. He dressed it up as generosity, as if the issue were pride rather than process. His final offer was framed as a favor, something he was willing to do to restore order. That was when I spoke. I told him I wasn't interested in money or titles. I wasn't negotiating. I wasn't angry. I was following the structure he'd approved and ignored. I explained, calmly, that nothing happening was personal. It was procedural. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't strategic. It was recalculating. Grant asked one question then. Quietly, "What do you want?" I told him the truth. I wanted nothing from him. The process was already moving. It didn't require permission or discussion. It required compliance. And that window had passed. He pushed back, insisting there had to be a way to reverse it. That's when I realized he still believed this was about leverage between people. I corrected him gently. It wasn't. It was about conditions that had been met and recorded. That was the moment his confidence cracked. Not loudly, just enough. He asked how I'd managed it. I told him I hadn't managed anything. I'd followed the language he'd signed off on without reading. The call ended shortly after. There were no threats left to make, no offers left to improve. Grant understood then that the situation had moved beyond emotion, influence, and hierarchy. Law doesn't respond to intimidation. It responds to accuracy. Here's the quiet lesson that surfaced in that moment. And it settled into the conversation without breaking it when someone underestimates you long enough. They forget to protect themselves from you, not because you're dangerous, but because you're thorough. After the call, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Being above someone doesn't feel like dominance when it's real. It feels like distance. I wasn't pushing him down. I was standing where he couldn't reach anymore. Grant would try again. I knew that. Men like him don't surrender control easily. But the shape of the conflict had changed. He was no longer speaking to an employee he could dismiss. He was confronting a system that didn't recognize his authority. As I set my phone down, I understood something clearly. The moment someone starts bargaining, they've already lost the assumption of control. Negotiation isn't strength, it's acknowledgement. And Grant had just acknowledged that whatever this was, it wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about rules he could no longer bend, and a voice he could no longer silence by calling it just a secretary. I knew Grant wouldn't stop after the call. Men who lose control rarely accept it quietly. They look for pressure points, not solutions. The response arrived through the channels he understood best: internal process and deniability. It started with HR. An email circulated asking for clarification about my conduct during the merger review. The language was careful, neutral, but the implication was obvious. I had interfered. I had acted without authorization. I had put the company at risk. None of it was true. But truth wasn't the objective. Isolation was. Former colleagues stopped responding to messages. Meetings I used to be copied on vanished. Someone leaked that I was emotional and unstable after being dismissed. That word traveled fast. It always does. Because it excuses ignoring facts. Grant didn't accuse me directly. He let the narrative do the work for him. The tension sharpened when legal requests followed. Subtle at first. Questions about timing, about access, about whether I had retained documents improperly. Each question assumed guilt. Each one tried to pull me into a defensive posture where mistakes happen. I didn't respond with explanations. I responded with records. Every email I had sent warning about the clause, every acknowledgement receipt, every attachment, I organized them chronologically. Not to argue, but to demonstrate pattern. Warnings issued, risks documented, decisions dismissed. I forwarded the file to my attorney and authorized a formal response. That changed the temperature immediately. Accusations lose power when timelines appear. Grant escalated internally. HR issued a notice stating the company was conducting a review into external interference. The phrase was deliberately vague. It painted me as an outsider acting against corporate interest. That was the line he wanted people to believe. So I widened the audience. My attorney submitted a notice to the company's board, attaching the full documentation set. Not an opinion, not a threat, just evidence. The filing explained the procedural trigger, the warnings ignored, and the retaliatory steps taken afterward. It requested preservation of records and transparency. That was the moment everything shifted. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. Calls stopped. Emails paused. The machinery that had been grinding forward abruptly hesitated. Boards don't like surprises, especially documented ones. Grant reacted badly. He demanded to know who had authorized contact with the board. He accused legal of failing him. He blamed HR for mishandling optics. None of it mattered. Once the board is informed, the narrative stops being managed and starts being examined. The confrontation wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Requests for explanation went out. Legal opinions were sought independently. HR was asked to justify actions. Each department realized it had been acting on assumption, not instruction, for the first time. Grant didn't control the flow of information. He was subject to it. I felt the tension ease slightly, replaced by focus. This was no longer about me versus him. It was about governance versus impulse. The company had to choose which it valued more. The mini-twist arrived quietly. A formal acknowledgement from the board confirmed receipt of my submission and initiated an independent review. That single document mattered more than any accusation. It meant the issue was now official. Grant's attempts to discredit me collapsed under their own weight. Retaliation looks different when timelines are visible. Smear campaigns fail when facts are ordered. I didn't celebrate. I stayed still. Conflict has momentum, and stopping it abruptly can cause damage. The process needed space to run. What struck me was how quickly power reversed once light entered the room. The same systems used to marginalize me now required fairness. The same silence used against me now protected me. Grant was still fighting, but he was fighting structure, not a person. That's a losing position by the end of the week. It was clear the company had crossed a line trying to protect speed and image. And once that line is crossed publicly, it doesn't disappear. It becomes record. The confrontation had moved into daylight, and Grant had no shadows left to hide in. The room didn't feel hostile when I walked in. It felt restrained. That was new. No raised voices, no posturing. Just people sitting straighter than usual, folders aligned, eyes alert. The energy had shifted from control to accountability, and everyone knew it. I didn't speak first. I waited to be asked. When the chair of the board nodded toward me, I stood and placed my documents on the table. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't describe feelings or motives. I laid out a timeline, dates, emails, attachments, decisions, consequences. Facts don't need decoration when they're complete. I explained how the clause worked, why it mattered, and when it had been flagged, I pointed out the responses I received, or didn't receive. I showed how the dismissal altered my legal position and why the system reacted the way it did afterward. Every statement I made was anchored to a record someone else could verify. Grant watched silently at first. He looked confident enough, leaning back, hands folded, as if he expected this to resolve itself. That confidence thinned as the questions shifted toward him. Not accusations, clarifications. When were you informed? Who reviewed this? Why wasn't it escalated? He answered carefully, avoiding specifics. He said legal had reviewed everything. He said timelines were tight. He said risks had been assessed. The board didn't argue. They asked for documentation. That was the moment the room turned. Elaine from legal slid a folder forward, her expression neutral. Inside were copies of my emails, printed, highlighted, dates circled, language clear. Grant had been warned, more than once. In writing, no one spoke for a few seconds. Silence carries weight when it's earned. Grant's posture changed. He leaned forward now, explanations speeding up. He reframed decisions as judgment calls, framed my concerns as cautious but non-critical. He tried to minimize the clause as unlikely. The board listened without reacting. Then one of the directors asked a simple question. If it was unlikely, why dismiss the warning instead of documenting it? Grant didn't have an answer that fit the record. The room noticed. What struck me most wasn't his discomfort. It was the absence of rescue. No one interrupted, no one redirected, no one softened the implications. When facts are clear, alliances hesitate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt relieved. Truth isn't satisfying when it surfaces. It's stabilizing. The confusion that had been dragging everyone in different directions finally had a center. The board asked me a final question. Had I acted outside the law at any point? I answered simply, no. I followed the procedure outlined in the agreement. I had not concealed anything. I had not altered any records. I had not misrepresented my position. Everything was traceable. Grant finally looked at me then, not with anger, but disbelief. He realized this wasn't about my reaction to being dismissed. It was about his refusal to slow down when slowing down mattered. The chair thanked me and asked Grant to step out briefly. He did, stiffly. The door closed without ceremony. The discussion that followed was quiet, procedural, decisive. Oversight failures were acknowledged. Retaliatory actions were questioned. Risk exposure was recalculated. The company had to confront not just a bad decision, but the pattern that allowed it. When Grant was called back in, the tone had changed again. This time, it was measured and firm. He was informed that an independent review would continue and that his authority was temporarily limited pending its outcome. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue against. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my papers slowly. No one rushed me. Several board members nodded, not approvingly, but respectfully. Justice doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles. The mini twist lingered in the air as I left. Grant hadn't fallen because of one clause. He fell because he'd been warned and chose confidence over responsibility. And that truth, once placed on the table, couldn't be pushed aside again. The decision didn't arrive with headlines or alarms. It arrived the way real consequences usually do, folded into routine. An internal memo went out before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Grant Holloway was being placed on administrative leave. Effective immediately. Pending final review. No adjectives, no praise, no defense. Just a sentence that ended something long before it reached the inbox. I wasn't surprised. The system had already done its work. Once oversight takes over, momentum changes direction quietly. Grant didn't storm out or issue a statement. His calendar simply emptied, meetings reassigned, access reduced, authority rerouted. Power rarely collapses in public. It drains away through processes designed to look polite. People whispered. Of course, they always do. But there was no scandal to feed on, no dramatic narrative to repeat. The board had contained it deliberately. This wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. The company needed stability more than spectacle. Grant's departure followed a week later, not fired, not celebrated, not escorted. He resigned, citing personal reasons. The same phrase executives use when the truth doesn't fit a press release. His name disappeared from leadership materials. His influence dissolved into footnotes. That was it. No farewell email, no standing ovation, no legacy speech. Watching it unfold felt strange. I expected satisfaction to feel sharper, louder, instead. It settled like a steady breath after holding one too long. The tension I'd been carrying didn't explode. It released. Justice didn't feel victorious. It felt orderly. The system had corrected itself without needing me to raise my voice again. That mattered. I hadn't won an argument. I'd exposed a weakness and let structure respond. That's the difference between revenge and resolution. In the days that followed, departments recalibrated, legal revised escalation protocols, compliance expanded review windows. Speed was no longer treated as a virtue by default. People slowed down, not because they were afraid, but because they understood what ignoring detail could cost. No one apologized to me directly. They didn't need to. Apologies are personal. This wasn't. Accountability had already been recorded where it counted. Then came the unexpected part. A board liaison reached out, asking if I would consider a conversation. No agenda attached, no assumptions stated. We met quietly, without ceremony. They asked how I saw the system failing and where it could be strengthened. They listened without interrupting. When the offer came, it wasn't framed as restitution. It was framed as necessity. A new advisory role focused on risk, contract structure, and escalation oversight, independent, direct reporting, clear boundaries. They didn't ask me to return to where I'd been. They asked me to help build what hadn't existed. I didn't answer immediately. Acceptance wasn't automatic. Trust takes longer to rebuild than authority. I asked questions. I reviewed terms. I made sure the role wasn't symbolic. Only then did I agree to consider it. What stayed with me wasn't the offer itself, but the shift behind it. The organization had learned something expensive and rare. Systems don't fail because of bad people alone. They fail because they reward the wrong behaviors long enough to normalize them. Grant had benefited from that normalization until it turned on him. Not cruelly, not dramatically. Precisely. I never spoke to him again. There was nothing left to say. He hadn't lost to me. He'd lost to the structure he assumed would always protect him. As I walked away from that chapter, I understood something clearly. Quiet justice doesn't seek recognition. It restores balance and moves on. And sometimes, the most satisfying ending isn't watching someone fall, but watching the system finally stand upright without them. That was the real ending. Not applause, not revenge, but alignment. I felt no urge to tell my story loudly or claim credit. The work had spoken. My role, whatever it became next, would be quieter than before and far more protected. I had learned that dignity survives best when carried forward, not shouted backward. The collapse behind me was complete, contained, and irreversible. And the calm that followed wasn't emptiness. It was room to build something better, slower, and to break. I didn't return to the office the way people expected. There was no victory walk, no dramatic reclaiming of space. What I carried forward was quieter than that clarity. In the days after Grant's departure, I reviewed the offer again, not as proof of worth, but as a choice. The role came with authority, access, and distance from ego. It also came with responsibility. I accepted it on my terms, with limits written plainly, because power without boundaries only repeats old mistakes. I was no longer a secretary, but I hadn't been one for a long time. Titles had changed. My understanding hadn't. What freed me wasn't position, but permission to act where knowledge mattered. I didn't need to raise my voice or settle scores. The system already understood me. There was relief in that realization, not relief that someone fell, but relief that accuracy finally outweighed confidence. I didn't feel larger than anyone else. I felt aligned. Fairness has a particular calm when it arrives without spectacle. I spent my first week building frameworks instead of defenses. Escalation paths were clarified, documentation standards tightened, decisions slowed just enough to be deliberate. People asked better questions. That was the real outcome, not punishment, but correction. The story others told about me didn't matter anymore. Some called it revenge, some called it luck. Neither fit. This wasn't about emotion. It was about understanding leverage and respecting structure. Knowledge compounds quietly when it's allowed to. Late one evening, after the workday had thinned out, an email appeared from the board chair. It was brief, almost awkward in its honesty. "We should have listened to you sooner." There was no apology attached. It didn't need one. The sentence stood on its own. I read it once and closed the laptop. That line wasn't validation. It was closure. Being heard isn't about acknowledgement after the fact. It's about building systems that listen before damage spreads. I walked forward without bitterness, carrying something better than revenge. I carried proof that dignity survives pressure, that real authority grows from comprehension, and that the quietest role in the room can still shape outcomes when it understands how everything connects. That understanding is what I keep. It doesn't fade when roles change or attention shifts. It stays useful, transferable, and honest. If there is a lesson worth carrying, it is simple power borrowed from titles expires. But power earned through understanding renews itself every time it is used carefully. I no longer needed permission to speak, only discipline to listen. The rest followed naturally, and that is where my story ends and begins again. Quietly, on my terms. At last. With clarity, balance, and purpose, still learning forward. When I look back on everything that happened, the lesson isn't about winning or losing. It's about how quietly life tests you when no one is watching. I didn't change because power shifted. I changed because I finally stopped shrinking myself to fit a system that benefited from my silence. The real value in this story isn't the downfall of one person, but the reminder that understanding, patience, and self-respect compound over time, often invisibly until they become impossible to ignore. There were moments when staying calm felt harder than fighting back. Moments when being overlooked hurt more than being wronged. But I learned something practical and human in those spaces. Dignity doesn't come from recognition. It comes from knowing exactly what you contribute, even when others pretend not to see it. Emotionally. That realization steadied me, humanly. It softened me. I stopped needing approval and started trusting alignment. If you're still listening right now, I'm curious, are you staying until the end? Because something here feels familiar. After you finish this story, do one small thing for yourself. Step outside for a few minutes and let natural light hit your eyes. It helps reset more than we realize, especially after carrying heavy thoughts. Where are you listening from today? A kitchen? A car? A quiet room after a long day? I'd really love to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part stayed with you the most? If this story resonated, a like or share helps it reach someone else who might need it. And if you want to keep exploring stories like this, told honestly and without noise, you're always welcome to subscribe. I'll be here. And the conversation doesn't end here. 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 Conversation doesn't end here.